Jesus, we ask. Many of you may not be familiar with the name Dylan Thomas. Probably many of you are familiar with one of his better-known poems. He's a 20th century poet who penned these lines. Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at the close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. It's the first stanza of a poem that goes on to reflect on the fact that we often, because of the human spirit, are resistant to death when it comes knocking. Smart people, the next stanza says, resist because their wisdom hasn't had a big enough impact yet in the world. My words have not been as much lightning in the world as I thought they might be. Good people rage against the dying of their light because there's so much good that they've not done yet. There's more good that could be done. Daring people who live in the present moment, they rage because despite all their attempts to harness the sun is leaving them behind. To put that point in a more popular frame, some of you may recall the old Pink Floyd song, Time. And one of the lines goes like this: no one told you when to run. You missed the starting gun. And you run to catch up with the sun, but it's sinking, racing around to come up behind you again. There's pictures of time ebbing away on us, death chasing us down, and we rage against the dying of the light. And Dylan Thomas pens these lines. It's sort of framed as a poem to his father as he's on his last days looking over the precipice and saying, don't flee into that good night. The point that he's making there, there's something about the human spirit that is, as Alexander Pope said, hope springs eternal in the human breast. Something indomitable about the human spirit. This life is good, and we don't want to let it go. But I see a stark contrast between what Dylan Thomas invites and the portrait of a very old man saying in a final parting blessing prayer, now, Lord, dismiss your servant in peace. Which is a euphemism for now it's okay for me to die, because my eyes have seen your salvation. How is it that Simeon could say this? If we were to take a kind of a psychological approach to the passage that was read for us, some of you may be familiar with Jordan Peterson, his sort of takes on the Bible. If I were to guess what he might do with this passage, he might say something like, well, this the point of this story is, old man's hope for a better future for our children. And there's something timeless about that, wanting to create a better world that our children will grow up in, and we won't see it, but our children will enjoy it. Is that all that's going on here? Simeon saying, holding this child in his arms, saying, now it's okay, Lord, depart, dismiss your servant in peace. That doesn't go half as deep as this passage is going. Far better here is this. Here's an old man whose whole life has been waiting for something in particular, a mighty deliverance that God had promised, that only God can achieve. And yet, Simeon recognizes that not all are going to recognize this God or his achievement, and some will even rage against it. So there's a long waiting that Simeon represents here. And it might not be accidental that at the beginning of Luke's gospel, we have a couple of pairs of very elderly people. Think of Zechariah and his wife Elizabeth. And you think of Simeon and Anna, who in chapter 2 here come to bless and speak about the child who's been born. These are representations of the previous generation, the long waiting, the anticipation of old. And here are the old who are waiting for the consolation of Israel. They represent the old, but they are giving voice to and they are witnesses to the new that is breaking in. So alongside the very old, you have a very young virgin, and you have a brand new baby in the midst of these chapters, Luke 1 and 2. So Simeon, what was he waiting for? What was the cause for his long waiting? Well, as I mentioned, he's awaiting a mighty deliverance that only God could achieve, a deliverance that he learned about from Isaiah. You thought we were finished with Isaiah, but that was just preparation. Isaiah is preparatory in all sorts of ways. In Luke chapter 3, just a few verses after our passage was read for us, Luke is going to quote from Isaiah chapter 40. And it's Isaiah 40 in particular that's in the background of some of the things that Simeon says and are said about him in the context of this passage. This is what he was waiting for, was the consolation of Israel in verse 25. The consolation of Israel. A similar phrase is used by Anna at the end of the description of her in verse 38. The redemption of Jerusalem. All those who are waiting for the redemption of Jerusalem. This is evocative of Isaiah chapter 40, verse 1, where God says to his people, comfort or console my people. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem. Her hard service has been paid for. She's received double for all her sins. And Isaiah goes on to recount the deliverance that God is about to bring about. It's a deliverance that is characterized by forgiveness, deliverance from oppression, from enslavement, from loss of goods, and it's a restoration. This is the consolation of Israel that Simeon has been waiting his whole life for. And so that's why in verse 30, when he takes the child in his arms, he says, my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared in the sight of all nations. If you flip over to Isaiah chapter 40, we may as well have the text fresh in front of us here. Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 5. We read about God's intervention, and all humanity, all mankind is going to see the glory of God. So here, Simeon says, my eyes have seen your salvation, which you prepared in the sight of all nations, a light for revelation to. It's not just a salvation that's in front of all the nations, so all the nations can see it. It's a revelation that's actually going to benefit the Gentiles themselves. The revelation to the Gentiles, verse 31. And so in Isaiah 40, it's hinted at. Isaiah 42, 46, 49, we have God talking about how salvation will come to the Gentiles. And a servant in particular is going to be appointed who will be a light to the Gentiles. This is all language that comes from Isaiah. Simeon turns to Mary and says to her, this child is appointed, is destined, is set to cause the rising and falling of many in Israel. Maybe Isaiah 40 is in the background there too, to some degree. Every valley will be raised up and every mountain will be leveled. A highway will be made possible for the glory of the Lord to be revealed. God, on his return to deliver his people, has flattened everything so that his invasion will be made possible. The rising and falling of valleys and mountains. So this is a salvation that Isaiah has populated the imaginations of the Israelites with. Simeon is one of them. He's been longing for this his whole life. And therefore it's a salvation that God has promised. It's a salvation that God alone can achieve. It includes the deliverance of Israel. It will mean glory for Israel, but it also spills beyond the boundaries of Israel to be a light to the Gentiles as well, a light to the nations. It's a deliverance of global proportions. Perhaps some of that grandeur of the consolation that Simeon is anticipating and longing for informed in part Rembrandt's depiction of Simeon's words here. We can go to the slide that has first image there, if that's possible. Rembrandt in 1631, when he's just 25 years old, this great Dutch master painted this Simeon's Song of Praise. and I can't describe it for you. So you'll just have to imagine it in all of its grandeur. But he's 25. It's very richly detailed. And the Christ child and Simeon are bathed in a bright light from above. Simeon is a commanding figure who's dressed in a luxurious robe. And gathered all around him are his family members, and there's crowds sitting on the steps of the temple. It's a grand, colossal scene depicted here. And the light shining on the child and Simeon coming from heaven. Here's the light to the Gentiles. Here's the salvation that can only come from the God can achieve. And Simeon indicates when he takes the child in his arms that the light of this salvation is going to refract in a couple different directions. I mentioned Pink Floyd earlier, so you probably have the iconic symbol of Pink Floyd in your mind. So you think of the prism, the refracting light. The light refracts towards the Jews as the glory of God fulfilling his covenant promises to his people. But it refracts toward the Gentiles as the surprising news that salvation is in Jesus and that they could be included. This is salvation that is going to cause, as Simeon will say to Mary in verse 34, the rising of many. What does he mean here? I mean, think of what unfolds in the chapters that ensue in Luke's gospel. As Jesus begins his public ministry, we see someone who dignifies the people who have ailments, cripples, blind people, those who are demonized. He dignifies them with his attention. He raises them up. He delivers them from what ails them, from what afflicts them. We see someone who treats those who are marginal in society with incredible tenderness and attentiveness. Across the pages of Luke's gospel, there's a dignity and an attention paid to people on the outside, widows, children, tax collectors, a crucified insurrectionist, outsiders. It's in Luke's gospel that we read about the Samaritan, who's the good one in the parable. Samaritan, the outsiders, the people the Jewish people can't stand. He's the good one who takes care of the Jew who'd been beaten up and left for dead by the side of the road. We see Jesus lifting up the poor and pronouncing special blessings on the poor. Among them is his own mother, Mary, who along with her husband, Joseph, comes into the temple here to do the proper offerings according to the law of Moses, bringing 2 doves. And if you read back in the law of Moses, that was a special concession for those who couldn't afford the proper offering. These are people who didn't have means. 2 doves is the affordable offering. And perhaps the ultimate rising or raising up of people that happens through the ministry of Jesus is more poignantly framed for us in his actually raising those who were dead. So think of the widow's son or Jairus' daughter. He will cause the rising of many, Simeon says. And what we're encountering in Jesus in the pages of Luke's gospel is a surprising God. A God who's not impressed by our halls of greatness or power. He's the sort of God who is more likely to be found in the back corner with a person who feels that everyone else has forgotten them, who feels that life has passed them by. They missed the sound of the starting gun. They're racing to catch up with the sun. And God is to be found attending to those people. But this destabilizes our expectations of God. And so this is the sort of light that isn't necessarily going to be universally received. So Simeon says to Mary, this child is destined to cause the rising and the falling of many. The word destined there could also be translated, this child is laid to cause the falling and the rising. There's perhaps a hint there that what we're imagining being set down is a stone that's going to cause some to stumble, but it's also going to be a foundation stone for the construction of a building, temple, a people that is a kind of a rising. So the stone image can kind of work both ways. And we have the image of falling or stumbling on a stone in Isaiah chapter 8. A stone that causes people to stumble. Elsewhere in Isaiah in chapter 9, God says, I'm going to take the wisdom of the wise and I'm going to confound it. I'm going to do something surprising that even the wise wouldn't have expected. And it's going to take their own self-confident reliance out from underneath them. I'm going to confound the wisdom of the wise. This is going to be a stone that causes some to stumble. What Simeon's talking about here is that some in Israel are going to be, well, Israel as a whole is going to be divided over Jesus. Some will be drawn to him and the kingdom that he proclaims and the God that he reveals. But some, think of Luke 4, where it's the very idea that God might bless outsiders like Naaman the Syrian or a widow in Zarephath, non-Israelites, while God overlooks Israelites who had leprosy and who were hungry. God overlooks those people. That's the issue that makes the Israelites in the town of Nazareth, when Jesus talks about this in the synagogue in Luke 4, makes them want to kill him. They rise up against him. Simeon says, this child is going to be a stone that causes some people to stumble, and he will be a sign that is spoken against. And all through Luke's gospel, we have people coming against Jesus. And one of the reasons they're hostile towards him is they don't like the nature of the kingdom that he brings. And it's going to culminate in his own death. That's what Simeon says to Mary. The hearts of many are going to be revealed as a consequence of this child. That's very interesting, because we've just read earlier that this is the light to the nations. This is the one who's going to be the glory of Israel. There's a revelation that is coming. God is revealing the kind of kingdom that he brings, the kind of God that he is. And in revealing himself, that light shines a light on our own hearts at the same time. That revelation cuts both ways. In John chapter 3, Jesus says to Nicodemus, some people, they don't actually come to the light. They recoil from it. They shrink back into the darkness because they don't want their deeds to be exposed. They don't want the inclinations of their hearts to be on full display. They like things the way they like them, and they don't like the way this is going because it maybe disadvantages them or doesn't pay into their glory or their coffers in the way that they want it to. And some of us, maybe all of us, need to pay attention to this. Because what will the light show up when he finally appears? But for many of us, the very fact that this light is not received is an ongoing source of pain for us. Maybe for some of you, it's a pain that feels like a sword piercing your own soul because some have rejected this light. For others, it's a long, slow ache. Simeon and Mary both know about this. Simeon's long, slow ache and Mary's painful invasion of a sword will pierce her heart as she sees her son repelled, rejected, lifted up and crucified. They know about this. And our confidence in the goodness of God and our joy in the light that he brings makes the darkness of our world and our communities and our families and our own hearts all the more jarring and wrong by comparison. So biblically speaking, hope, the kind of hope that Simeon represents, and lament, and pain, those are twins. They are both longings by which we seek to draw more of the light forward from the future into our dark present. We hope and we lament at the same time because we see the darkness still here. But here's good news. Because the light that came, the light that then died, has been raised. Here is the ultimate rising that Simeon points toward. The word he uses here, anastasis, is a key word that runs through Luke and Acts. It's the word from which we get the name Anastasia, resurrection or insurrection. a rising or an uprising. This child is going to be a kind of an insurrection on the categories of darkness that destabilizes the way of the world. But this child is a resurrection. This child is going to cause the rising of all who are on the outside, who have felt like time has passed them by. So think, if you fast forward to the beginning of Acts, which is the sequel to Luke's gospel, think of Peter, who stands up in the temple and says to a group of people who are wondering what on earth has just happened as the Spirit has filled a number of the believers. He says, you know what's happened? This Jesus whom you crucified, God has raised this Jesus to life, and he has made him both Lord and Messiah. That's the beginning of Acts. Now back to the beginning of Luke, where Simeon, waiting in the very same temple for the Lord's Messiah, says, my eyes have seen your salvation. What did Simeon see? He saw the seed. He saw just a baby. But he had the eyes to see in that seed the beginnings, the rumblings, the shadowy outline of the foundations of God's radical new world. Did he know that this final rising that Peter talks about could have the power to pull him up in his own resurrection? Is that perhaps why he says to the Lord, now you may dismiss your servant in peace? I'm not sure that Simeon could see all of that. But this ultimately is why we, all the more than Simeon, may say, now dismiss your servant in peace, when we come to the end of our days. So if we rage, it's against the night that ultimately has no hold on us. But that's because the light that died has been raised. So in the end, all of our talk of the indomitable human spirit, it's really a feeble rage that rages against the dying of our own lights. We will never feel that our words or our deeds have had enough impact, have never done enough to beat back the darkness of the world. We'll never feel like we've squeezed the orange of our lives dry. But what if our failing eyes caught the glimmerings of the light, capital L light, that Simeon saw that day? The beginnings of the dawn, the insurrection brought about by God that means the resurrection of all who are attached to him. The deliverance that only God could achieve, the real ground of human hope. If you go to the next image there, at the very end of his life, Rembrandt painted Simeon with Christ child one more time. First one I showed you is when he was showing off all he could do. He's 25. It's glorious, it's extravagant, it's luxuriant. But this take on Simeon with the child is much more intimate, muted, scaled down. This was Rembrandt's last painting. He left it unfinished on an easel in his studio when he died, suddenly at the age of 60. And at that point in his life, Rembrandt was bankrupt. His eyesight possibly failing. His work was no longer in demand. His wife and all but one of his children had died already. His mistress had died. His house and his possessions had been auctioned off to pay his debts. He even had to sell his dead wife's grave to satisfy his creditors. From one vantage point, you might think of his life at this point as a failure. Did he rage against the dying of the light? No. Old Rembrandt picked up his brush one last time and painted old Simeon in quiet, prayerful gratitude, tenderly and intimately holding the light. Maybe, just maybe, Rembrandt saw in this child the one who could bring about his own rising. Lord, stretch us, flood us with your light. Enable us to yearn for you, to participate in the inbreaking of the new kind of kingdom that only you can bring. May we be part of the rising that only you can achieve. Grant us your joy in this season.